Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bradenton Kiwanis Club. I am your club president, Heather Doyle. Please join with me in singing America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Invocation by Mr. Grips. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It is my great pleasure to ask that Mr. Steve Dye come up and to announce our very special speaker.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? It's my pleasure on behalf of the International Relations Committee, which is a mysterious and often misunderstood committee and intends to remain that way, to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Robert Barylski. Dave Bassett came up to the table and said he thinks he's seen every time Dr. Barylski's been here speaking, and we figured out it had to be sometime on or after 1979 when he moved to Sarasota. Dr. Barylski is an expert on civil-military relations in Russia, Russian policy towards peoples and states of Islamic heritage, especially the Soviet Union, and a student of international energy politics. He received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Brown and Harvard University. He has published in leading American and European scholarly journals dealing with Soviet and Russian affairs and spoken at major conferences in the US, Russia, Europe, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. He recently retired from administration and teaching at the University of South Florida and is active in civil affairs, especially foreign policy education through the Sarasota Institute for Lifelong Learning. Bob and his late wife, Irene, came to Sarasota in 1979. Irene taught at Pine View for 25 years. Bob was dean and campus CEO over USF Sarasota from 1979 to 1990, when New College and USF still shared one campus. I'd almost forgotten about that. He worked with community leaders to develop, fund, and implement a new campus master plan, which launched a decade of construction in cooperation with the Ringling Museum and the Oslo Theater to revive and enhance the educational, cultural, and historic district at the gateway to Sarasota and Manatee counties. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Robert Barylski, and let's hear about Russia.
Hi. My gosh, I mean, we've had Russia up to here, haven't we? Back in January, or just in Christmas time, we got emails from young cousins in Moscow. They had everybody's email address in the whole family. Huh? It was kind of interesting. So the kids contacted me and they said, well, who's going to answer them? It turned out that Anton and his brother are in cybersecurity. Right? Yeah, it is interesting. Their dad was a genius. He worked in the Nuclear Institute in Moscow. So, you know, when we used to go over to Russia, until the end of communism, it was really touchy about whether we could even visit with any of these people. You know, and it took until, 1993, actually, to be able to go home with some of them. Things got loose, the country got quite free. And then Putin started tightening things up. You know, the country was too loose. It was coming apart at the seams. They had Muslim rebellions in the south. Police forces were becoming enormously corrupt. A lot of former KGB officers themselves became involved in organized crime or semi-organized crime. There was real concern that the country would fall apart. And the groups they would call them the Patriotic Kgb, with Putin at the head of this, really started to bring law and order back to the country. And his popularity really comes from that. Popularity isn't because he calls us names or gives us trouble, but because people remember the 1990s in Russia as a complete disaster. Gorbachev himself is not popular at all. Even though he's still alive, he's not invited to be on TV talk shows, to give his opinion on current politics. They mistrust him. They think that he really failed in his job. I know we hold him in great high esteem, but people blame the collapse in the economy and all the suffering that they had in the 90s. We don't realize it here, but we had our Great Recession, or whatever we called it recently. Hardly a memory, right? We're booming. But in Russia, in all the former Soviet republics, the economy dropped by 40–50%. People were standing on the streets, you know, selling family heirlooms to get a little extra money. Inflation went to the thousands of percent. I remember the old great aunt in Moscow. She had this miserable pension of $45 a month with inflation raging. You know, yeah, they had free medicine, but there was no medicine. You know, things like that. I mean, there was crime all over the place. People were stealing the light bulbs out of the Moscow subways. You walk down the streets and you'd see these lines where people were tapping into phone booths, you know, to have a free telephone, or tapping into, you know, the power lines. It was nuts. So somebody had to clean it up, you know, and so Vladimir Putin is the one they give credit for cleaning it up. And that's the basis of his popularity. So it's one thing to clean it up, but then the next thing became whether you could rebuild the country or not. So let me show you some things. All right, so let's talk about Putin's election. And we've heard about, you know, Paul Manafort and people going to Ukraine or Russia and advising different candidates, right? Ever since the early 1990s, American advisors have been working in the former Soviet Union, not just Ukraine, but Moscow as well. And Putin is the benefit of a lot of modern campaign ability and technology. They studied in their own country voting behavior, region by region. I had a friend who was doing that in Moscow. You know, they was doing that already by 1993, when they wanted to know who would win to be mayor or whatever. You could come and hire Russian political consultants who had learned that business from us. So, you know, one of the things that we were being told, or we were imagining during the Clinton-Trump election, was that somehow people over here had to be working with the Russians to help them figure out about how different states voted and what particular constituencies in the states were important to turning elections and all, and how public opinion works in the United States. They did not need that from us, because they had their own experts on us. Got it? I mean, Any Russian political scientist interested in this stuff could go to conferences at Yale University where they do voting behavior. We never prevented them from coming and learning from us and adopting our methodology so that they could understand about voting, campaigning, campaign posters, all that stuff. So they would know that. And all you had to do is watch the news in this country during any election where we gave great details about every state, right? And how we would lean and who were the reds and who were the blues and what was important. So there's nothing secret about it. What's odd is that we assumed that adversaries on the outside would not know how things operate here and would not seek to influence the outcome of an election, right? We all, oh, surprise, surprise. You know, whereas if you asked me in those days, it should be no surprise. Of course they're going to try to influence the election. Hey, this thing just changes by waving my hand. Oh, anyway, all right. Well, whatever is up there now. So I'll talk a little bit about. So the Russians had experts on all these techniques. They also created Putin was very interested in creating teams at the Ministry of Defense. In fact, I can show you some slides of the new Ministry of Defense headquarters rooms where they can watch and show on Russian TV the war in Syria. They'll have the great screens all laid out around the Russian Pentagon room dedicated to this. They'll show the drone images of fighters running from one neighborhood in Damascus to another. Then they'll show you street scenes within Damascus, etc. So we have the same kind of ability. They have copied and learned and have the similar abilities to us, to watch what's going on around the world, to watch what's going on in the war, to monitor politics, to come over here on the internet, to get into my computer, to get into your computer, to hack, etc. So if we've had any problem, it was getting used to the idea that competition in the future, or even now already, is already deeply involved with the internet and cyber stuff. We're still producing lots of old tanks, aircraft carriers and all the rest. And where are we going to produce cyber warfare defense for ourselves? It's a tough one to think about. But if you get into, even with our military experts, they're just going to tell you that the stuff that's coming down the line is so scary and so different. New kinds of weapons, miniaturization of weapons, multi-warhead situations. Russia's got these fast torpedoes that move around underwater and then can come out and then blow up your port. All kinds of stuff is going on. Now, I'd say if we should worry about something as American people or people in generally in the world, is that we have a lot of old thinking, and the new challenges are quite different. And we need some new thinking about defense and security. Okay, let's jump around now back to Russian politics. Here's the opposition leader we favor over here. His name is Navalny. He stages protests in Moscow regularly. The government will say, okay, you can have your protest over here, but he will deliberately go right on the main street leading to the Kremlin, so that he'll get himself arrested and be on BBC and on all the evening news. What they do, they pick him up, they haul him off to jail, they fine him, they let him out in a couple of days later. They also have lots of people in every key Russian city who are trained to come and do law and order interventions, and plenty of buses to arrest people, take them down to the station, yell at them, whack them with a billy club a little bit, and then let them all out. They don't want to keep them all in prison because you can imagine over here, you get arrested, we're going to give you a free lawyer, all of this stuff. put you in jail. It costs a lot of money. I mean, they would rather take your name down, let you know that, hey, this could be bad for your job, bad for your dad's job, your kid's ability to get in college and everything. So why don't you go home and cool it? They're not filling camps, you know, with people who are arrested. They arrest them basically and they release them. You know, occasionally somebody falls off a balcony or something. You're laughing because a reporter the other day who reported something on Syria that was very unpleasant fell off his balcony and died, and his name was Bradenton. So, you know, you got maybe a dozen or 15 people like this over the last 20 years. It's not every day, but every so often the message is delivered. Putin will say, this is horrible. I'll take personal interest in making sure this case is investigated. I haven't, you know, I can't remember a single one that was really properly figured out. And so they just kind of leave it. I mean, it goes on. So there's intimidation, right? So the game in Russia is, look, if you mind your own business, you want to be a wacko with tattoos or, you know, believe in whatever, and you can. But don't mess around with certain parts of politics. If you get in there, it's certainly going to be bad for your career unless you're online with Putin's party. So what they've done essentially in Russia is reestablished one-party rule without terror. It's basically carrot and stick. You're in Bradenton here. I don't know, do we have two political parties here these days? I'm laughing because I've been around a long time, right? I remember when we got to Sarasota, and if we wanted money for the campus, I needed to be a Republican, so it helped. And when we tell visitors from Russia, they'd say, oh yeah, I understand. It's the same thing in Russia. If you want anything for your university, you got to play along. But it was a big deal for Putin to rebuild this system that was falling apart. In other words, he wanted to have the Kremlin and the central government be able to control what was happening all across the vast Soviet Union. And when the Communist Party dictatorship fell apart, then everybody here and there just stopped paying attention to the center. Terrible problems with corruption, crime, because the criminality was already there under communism. Old communism was basically a mafia system. We had too much over here about, you know, ideology and the rest of it, but what it really was a mafia system. You belonged to the mafia, you know, the local gang, and the local gang had godfathers, senior figures really, who were the local oligarchs who controlled who got what, you know, who got teaching positions, who got promoted, who got the better apartments, etc. And so if you wanted any managerial position whatsoever in the old Soviet Union, you had to play along with the party and be a member of the party. All right, so when that broke up, when they proclaimed the end of communism, people were kind of confused. Well, how are things going to work in the regions? Well, what happened in the regions was the system of still operating like a mafia held, except they disobeyed the center. They were so happy that they could get away with whatever they wanted because of a weak government in Moscow, which was bad for the country. You know, so Putin's problem was reestablish an effective government across the whole country. You know, and how do you do that? Well, the Russian Constitution is wonderful this way because the president can hire and fire any governor. Can you imagine over here, right, if our president could just fire any governor he didn't like? Hire and fire any top general, anybody in security or in the equivalent of the FBI and all of that, without even having to consult with the so-called parliament. And that constitution comes from 1993 with Boris Yeltsin, when they ended Gorbachev's chaotic democratic reform and started going in this direction. So you have a president in Russia who's extremely powerful. So he had to demonstrate that power by firing people. And then when it came to the people who privatized the oil, natural gas industry and so on, who became wealthy, the oligarchs, he had to take and show to them that any one of them could be nabbed, stripped of their wealth, and thrown in jail. So that's why he took the oil oligarch, who was named Khodorkovsky, threw him in jail in Siberia, took the whole oil company's assets. He said, we're having an auction. There were only 2 people in the room and only 1 bid. No, I'm not kidding. All right? And then as far as the 1,500 other oligarchs, they brought them all into the Kremlin for a meeting around the same time and said, look, you guys have to cooperate, pay taxes, help us rebuild the government. We'll protect you and your assets, but the deal is, if you don't cooperate with us, see Khodorkovsky sitting there in jail in Siberia, every single one of you is guilty, because we know that all of these privatizations initially at the end of communism were corrupt. And you know it too. I know it, you know it. I can get you. So if you want to play along and keep your hundreds of millions and your billions, then you're going to support me. You're going to support the rebuilding of this United Russia Party, and we'll establish law and order. You'll have your assets protected, and we go on from here. So it exists really as an alliance between the national patriotic gang that wants a strong Russia, strong central government, an ability to impose and control law and order on the whole vast country, and the oligarchs. One of the things we're trying to come up with in Washington these days with all the Treasury Department stuff and sanctions on oligarchs is to try to break that alliance up between the oligarchs and the Putin centrists. I don't know if that's going to work. It doesn't make sense to me, because I think we underestimate the support in Russia for a strong central government, period, because of fear of chaos. Okay, so Navalny, he gets arrested 2 or 3 times a year. He didn't even get to be on the ballot for president. Putin got 76% of the vote. He really did. I mean, it was very well monitored, because he also counted that if you were the governor or the mayor in any particular town and he didn't get a good turnout there, you knew you were going to be in trouble. So they all had to help get out the vote, all right? And they got out the vote. It was fair in the Russian sense, all right? The other candidates, people who will vote for kind of the liberal alternative, come out to about 5% of the total population in the country. This has been that way now since, I don't know, 1988, 1989. It's pretty predictable. But 5% of a 20 million greater Moscow area could still get a big crowd, right, on the streets. But that doesn't hide the fact that most of the country is okay with the idea that unless there's a strong central government in Moscow, criminality, corruption will run rife all over the country, and people, will have a lousy life. So you support the strong central government. Let me see if I can move this thing. All right, here's Putin's after-election rallies on Red Square. Putin's a big party man. Red Square now has huge parties with bands playing and all kinds of screens projecting stuff, party after party after party. Moscow's a fun city now with parties for all kinds of occasions. And he copied, the best standards from the West. They're common now in Russia for all this kind of political rally celebration stuff. Meetings with his campaign workers, youth movements, all that stuff. They do. Now the woman over here up in the left-hand corner, you can hear me, right? Her name is Sobchak. Here she is. They had presidential debates also. on television, because, again, they copied everything that we're doing. So they had presidential campaign debates. This stinker over here, Zhirinovsky, who's a national fascist, Putin lets him run around and complain about the U.S. and everything all the time because he knows he's not a real challenge, but he absorbs a lot of wacko votes, right? So Sobchak over here is the daughter of the former mayor of St. Petersburg, Russia, who was a major Democratic leader. Over here we were saying, well, she's a tool of Putin, but I'll tell you, she's the only one who got up on television, you know, during the candidates as a debate, and looked right in the camera and said everything we would like to say. She did it. And when she was accused of being a political whore by that crazy fascist over there, she took her cup of water and walked over to him on live TV and threw it right in his face. All right? And he said, you know, you tools of American propaganda and all should leave the country. And she looked at the camera and said, no, until people like you leave our country, we won't be able to live the free life according to the best European standards that most of the young people want. And then she said, you know, this is the whole national audience. I know I'm not going to win this election, but I am not going to stop this campaign. It's going to take years and years and years, but little by little, we're going to move this country into Europe with the best democratic standards, and that's our goal. And all of you out there who think it's impossible, I'm telling you to have some hope, and we're going to work for this. And I know I could be killed even, but I'm going to do it, and I'm not stopping. Now, wasn't that pretty cool? Right. Woman got up there, young woman, and she did this beautifully. She didn't get much attention over here. Navalny gets all the attention. They say somehow he's the real dissident and she isn't, but you know, somebody who wants to be an irresponsible populist and overturn everything is not the kind of candidate people really want. So she's good. He's handsome and speaks well, but he's not going to get anywhere. All right, so he got his 76% of the vote, made him real happy. Yeah. Now, this is a demonstration in Moscow this week. What do you think they're doing here? No, they're not supporting the president. He's in the demonstration himself. He's marching. And Benjamin Netanyahu's with them marching too. And they're all carrying pictures. And they're carrying pictures of relatives who served in World War II. What they do now in Russia, apart from the big military parade, for the celebration of the end of the Second World War in Europe, all the families come out. Children, mother, father, grandmother, carrying pictures of people who served in World War II to defeat Nazi Germany. It's an extremely wonderful, patriotic thing that they're doing. This is another reason why people like Putin, because he is that kind of an enthusiastic Russian patriot. So I don't think our young people know a lot about World War II, right? You can ask families, they'll tell you, well, we know somebody served, whatever. But what they wanted to do in Russia, and Putin wanted to do, is keep the memory of the war alive, because that's their big victory from their point of view. And it's something they can consolidate the country around. So they not only did it in Moscow, 1 million people turned out in Moscow for that. It wasn't featured on our evening news because it wasn't anti-Putin. All right? So, you know, because we don't get enough regular news, I watch Russian news every single day. I mean, the stuff they're watching in Moscow. And so you know, you can watch and see how he develops the country, how he's been trying to fill the gap left after communism with Russian patriotism and so on. So memory of World War II is a really big deal part of what he's been doing. So there he is, carrying his dad's picture, because his dad didn't die, but he was severely wounded in the battle for Leningrad. And you got Netanyahu over on the left, you see him? Also carrying a portrait of a relative. Netanyahu spent 9 hours with him on that day, going to the parades, going to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, chatting, meeting veterans. And then Netanyahu went home and he let fly 70 or 50 missiles on Iranian targets in Syria. You know, so you got this nutty relationship that we don't cover very well because it's too confusing to explain, where Russia and Israel are cooperating in Syria. All right? Well, anyway, you can see the kids come, they have the big parade, and they're little children too. So the idea is to pass on from generation to generation the memory of the war and the sacrifices the people made. Now, I think that, you know, we try, and we can see that Memorial Day National Concert and 4th of July are good. We have 4th of July and all, but we don't have any parade here. I mean, imagine if we had a real parade in Bradenton where, you know, the kids and the families carried the portraits of people who fought in the wars, and everybody did that, you know, as a real big holiday. So as I say, Putin started doing this, and now by this year they get over 1 million people in the Moscow parade. And the old timers, and they also interview, you know, the people who are in their 80s and 90s from the war, have television shows with them. In addition, of course, they have the big military parade, you know, and show off the new missiles and all of that stuff. So, you know, in May, first week of May, first week and a half, they had the May Day, the old communist holiday. They have the World War II celebrations. They had Putin's inauguration. They had the March of the Veterans in honor of the veterans and their families. They had, I mentioned, Putin's inauguration. So they just had a really good time for a couple of weeks in Moscow with not much work being done. Remember this? Come on, those are missiles flying right at Florida. This is Putin's speech. His State of the Union message in Russia this year. He put it in a special place. He put up big screens, and he wanted to announce to us that his people have outsmarted us, spending way less money coming up with new weapons that have trashed all of our ABM systems, and they've got weapons now that are completely unstoppable. Huh. They say that we're going to bankrupt ourselves because we spend so much money on weapons we don't need to keep every congressman's district happy. We don't let the military really set the priorities for how we're going to spend that money because they have to get the whole budget through. So they have to spend on a lot that they don't want to spend on, and we don't get to spend enough on some of the new stuff. And we risk falling behind in certain areas, you've heard this, behind the Chinese and even the Russians. That we're going to bankrupt ourselves if we keep spending on all the old stuff and try to spend it on the new stuff. It's an interesting message. I remember Gates talking to Senator McCain when Gates retired, and they both agreed. You know, Gates said the same thing. You've got to let us set priorities for our spending and not make us spend on everything just to make everybody happy in every district all around the country. We can't afford that. You know, I mean, Trump just upped the budget, but Putin showed him, hey, we've got new weapons and we spend 1/10 of what you spend. Yeah, that's it. Well, when I saw that speech, you know, I'm watching it at 3 o'clock in the morning because I don't know, it's 11 or whatever in Russia. And it said, What? What's this guy doing? He's blowing up the Central Command. Right? He's having a little fun here. He's blowing up the Central Command in Tampa, and we happen to be nearby. Unless he uses one of his little small super weapons, you know, that just blow up like this room. Could be a mess, huh? So what he did, no, he showed all these new videos, some of them basically just cartoons, of new kinds of weapons. And said, look, you guys over there, you wouldn't listen to me. You put ABM systems in Poland, you're putting them all around, you were threatening us, you wouldn't listen, and now you're gonna listen because look what we've done. We warned you that if you did that stuff, we would come up with a response. Our response so far has been to kind of not do anything yet. We're going to have to talk, because it's crazy for us and Russia to be wasting, you know, our assets on all this stuff. His image day in and day out on the news, Mr. Fix-It, wherever there's a problem, he goes there in Russia. If there's a flood, he goes there. If there's a natural disaster, he goes there. And he's always building stuff. He's like Herod the Great, Herod the Builder. He builds, he builds, he builds. His favorite thing is building. Really. Building, building, building is what he likes. Look at Moscow now. All this stuff was thrown up during the last 30 years when he's been in power. That's just the business city part of Moscow. They call it the business whatever. Okay? Pretty impressive, right? Another view of the new Moscow. New apartment houses. And guess what? They saw what our realtors do and they copied everything, even the expressions. Sometimes they just use the English ones. Gated community, 24-hour service, gym, etc., etc. All right? Copied it all. Lots of parties, builds new bridges. Oh yeah, infrastructure, right? If anybody had crumbling infrastructure, it was Russia. It's still crumbling. But he builds and he builds and he builds. That's what he loves doing. Making Russia a place to go to resorts on the Black Sea. Right? They used to have crappy old Soviet hotels. Now they've got a lot of great new stuff. And also ski resorts. You know, there were basically no ski lifts as we understand them, you know, in the old Soviet Union. It was hard work to go skiing. Now they've got everything imaginable. How about Siberia? New gas liquefaction plants launched up there. New nuclear icebreakers to keep the ice down so they can ship the liquefied natural gas. And even a floating nuclear power station to bring electricity to remote areas. And when he took power, in 1988, the first thing he faced was that Russian submarine that sank with everybody alive on it. That horrible disaster. He said, I'll rebuild the military and I won't stop till I do. And man, he has done a good job on that. That's why they like him. In the armed forces over there, they think he's terrific. So he's got new pipelines going to Germany, pipelines going to China. He took the Crimea, right? Here's the Russian Ministry of Defense on the Moscow River, the Pentagon at night. So when they're having party night, they illuminate it. I mean, I can imagine under communism, you know, everything was so dour. Trying to make Moscow into a fun city. It used to be terrible. Now it's like Las Vegas or something. It's absurd. Oh yeah, maybe mention Donald Trump here in Moscow. My goodness. I mean, it was like a candy shop given his proclivities. The other thing, though, is the Moscow billionaires throwing their money all around South Beach in Miami, Manhattan, London, right? You saw the Mueller stuff? They're going to dig up a lot of stuff related to Russian oligarchs. You see them popping up on the news. You find like Viktor Vekselberg, who was the gas pipeline oligarch, who bought all the Forbes Fabergé eggs, remember, at an auction, and he gave them for free to Russia, to the museums. He's got relatives over here. I mean, who in Russia doesn't have a relative over here these days? A lot of people do. The connections are amazing, relatives, business partners, America, London, Israel, Russia. I mean, it's such a network of relationships now that it's something amazing. The corrupting power of oligarch billions. Oh yeah, remember he demonstrated his new missile capabilities by firing from the Caspian Sea and hitting targets in Syria? And he had permission to fly over Iran, his little ally. Okay, this is inside the Russian Ministry of Defense, what I was telling you about, where you can sit there and watch the war live. So people could sit in Moscow and watch the missiles being fired from the Caspian Sea over Iran to Syria, and then watch them hitting their targets in Syria. Yeah, as I said, they just spent 9 hours together, and then Netanyahu went home and he bombed the Iranian targets in Syria. And yet somehow Russia and Iran are supposed to be allies? This is really complex intrigue. And he gets along, though, with the Iranians and with the Turks. And the king of Saudi Arabia, the old one, came with how many people in his delegation? 1,500 came to Moscow with the king. What do they have to talk about? 10 million barrels of oil a day, right? We do 10, 11, they do 10, 11, the Saudis do 10, 11. And what were they saying on Russian TV last night? Thank you, Donald Trump, for driving the price of oil up with all these new tensions. They went from $40 to $79 a barrel. So you take your extra $39, $40 a barrel, multiply it by, the 5 million barrels a day he exports, and he taxes 70% of that to go in the Kremlin treasury, and that provides him with the natural gas and with the oil stuff, 50% of his annual budget. Yeah, he's happier now, isn't he? Not because Trump did it on purpose, but, Qataris come to Moscow, and of course, Assad. Hey, should we have ever gone after overthrowing Assad, really? Why were all the people leaving Syria in droves? Why aren't they leaving now? They're not leaving now because they don't think their country's going to completely fall apart and go to hell. When Putin came in, and Putin and Turkey and Iran started cooperating, the refugees stopped leaving. Right? They thought the whole country would go to hell and be destroyed in civil war, so they wanted to leave with their families as fast as they could. And so any restabilization of Syria stopped the refugee flow. Oh, by the way, Putin loves religion. That's another part of his program. His program is clean living, traditional religious values are good, patriotism is good. Western drugs and crazy liberalism, no good. So he makes sure that the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the heads of the Muslim communities, the heads of the Buddhists, and the heads of the Jewish communities attend every major public event. They're all invited, they get good seating, and they're treated nicely. And he knows them all on a first-name basis. Those 4 religions get preference in Russia. Baptists, Jehovah's Witnesses, different kinds of fundamentalisms don't get preference in Russia. If you want to be a minister over there, they'll give you a tourist visa, and they won't give you a work visa, and then they can arrest you at any moment and throw you out of the country if you're doing work. And guess who the chaplain to the Protestant communities in Moscow right now is? A Bradenton kid who was one of my former students. He's serving in Moscow for the World Council of Churches. And he's there under the same problem. He's supposed to be pastor there, but they only give him a tourist visa, so that, you know, they could ask him to leave at any time for being a pastor, having been a pastor. And by the way, the church he works from is just up the street from the Kremlin. So how about that for, you know, another odd connection here? Okay, I'll leave you with a couple of pictures here. Here's the biggest mosque in Moscow, built with Saudi money. And here are worshipers out on the street because there's not enough room in the biggest mosque. I could give you lots of pictures of the streets completely filled with Muslim worshipers in Moscow. Moscow has a big Muslim population, particularly young men who have come up from the Muslim south, Kazakhstan, especially Tajikistan next to Afghanistan, for jobs. Russia's population was shrinking because of all the mess in the 90s. They needed a workforce to build all those buildings you saw, new subways and everything. Where did the workers come from? They came from Tajikistan, and they're all Muslims. And they're living in Moscow in basements, poor apartments. They are supposed to stay for 4 months, go back, and then come back again. But they stay, and they're becoming more or less a permanent presence. The size of this group is similar to those we have coming from Mexico and Central America here. We understand how important those folks are to our economy. I'll just say you, it's the same thing in the Russian big cities, except they're Muslim boys. And some of them become radicalized because there are agents for radical Muslim groups working. Putin's people have to go out all the time after this. I mean, Putin's had 3,000 people at least in Syria from Russia who are fighting on ISIS's side. It's another big reason he wanted to go there, to make sure that when they were captured, he knew what was happening to them. He didn't want them coming back to Russia to fight. Okay, there were 2 Muslim rebellions in Russia in Chechnya. Here's what it looked like after Putin went and blew up the towns and cities where the Muslim radicals used the cities as bunkers. We see the same thing in Syria, right? They dig into the cities and say, well, if you want to fight us, you're going to destroy your own city. That's the terrible choice you end up making. Yeltsin used to be soft. Putin wasn't soft. He said, if you have to blow up the whole town, we're going to get them, and I want them all wiped out. And he had lists like we used to have the lists of certain people we wanted wiped out. He had them. He had his teams going after him. He wiped them out. This is what the capital city of Grozny in the south looked like after he defeated the Muslim rebellion. All right? This is it today, rebuilt. Not only rebuilt, but with a giant mosque. And so he's created down there a pretty well-disciplined, pro-Moscow Muslim republic within Russia. He thinks, you know, that you can do negotiations like that in Syria and quiet things down. I mean, we don't have any such similar experience because we never had a big chunk of our country, just say Texas being a Muslim rebel republic, with us having to go blow up Houston. And so wrap your mind around that a little bit and understand some of what's in his head, you know, when he's dealing with Muslim issues and radical issues. He's all in favor of normal Muslim life, but he wanted the radicals crushed. And that's his last goodbye to you. He's playing hockey with the Night League in Moscow. So anyway, what I wanted to do is to let you know how Putin presents himself in Russia, right? Why he was popular in Russia. And to, let's say, make it so we could, I don't know, we should be a little calmer about him. We can exaggerate his power and his influence and all, but I think we've overdone it. You know, I always was of the opinion that the big strategic threat in the long run is China, large population, cutting-edge technology, 350,000 students in our universities every year, a lot of them studying science and technology, transferring technology by making IBM, everybody who works over there in China, train the locals, right? They get a part of our market. They've got their 2025 plan to be ahead of us in every crucial field. The Russians are watching the rise of China. There are 1,200,000,000, 300,000,000 Chinese, only 140 million Russian citizens. Most of Russia is depopulated near the Chinese border. You know, quietly in Russia, they worry about the rise of China. They don't worry that we're going to invade them and take them over. You know, so when Trump says there ought to be possibilities for, you know, switching where Russia is and getting Russia to cooperate more with us if we play our cards right, and most Russians would agree that they have to be with Europe in the long run because the big threat is coming from Chinese domination. You know, so I was delighted when I heard, you know, the Trump campaign saying these things. But because of all the mess about so-called collusion and interference and everything, we've ended up probably having a good strained relations with Russia, but I don't buy the idea that they're the worst since the Cold War and all of that stuff. Because, I mean, Russia earns its money in Europe, selling natural gas and oil in Western Europe. Russian oil refined in Europe is probably fueling our tanks in NATO. NATO, in fact, is actually protecting the whole Russian pipeline system, if you think about it. But, yeah, because the money making is Russia sends the stuff to Europe, the euros come back to the Kremlin treasury. Without a stable and prosperous Europe buying Russian natural gas and oil, there's no money in the Kremlin treasury to speak of. Really. You know, so they can't afford any real blow-up with us. That's the silliest, crazy idea possible. It'd be the end of their whole system, which feeds on selling us oil and natural gas. So NATO's protecting that. It is all the NATO countries, basically, who are buying that stuff. And even in the Baltic states, you know, 1,200,000 people out of a total of 6-7 million are actually Russians. So we've got, you know, 1,200,000 Russians in NATO now. I mean, it's way more complicated than the silly politics we hear about. They can't pull apart from us without sinking. You know, so Putin kind of blew himself up. I can really do whatever I want. But basically, his position is not that strong. He needs us. And in the long run, given the problems of the Muslim South, and those kids every single day coming into Russia, and the rise of China, where's he going to go? China over here, the Muslim South there, he's got to cozy up to Europe. It's inevitable. So, I kept you way too long. Here's Putin's taking his oaths of office. Then he goes to church in the Kremlin church right next to the palace. Prays. So there he is. He's not a dumb politician at home, right? No.
I, for one, could probably listen to hours of this. I find it fascinating.
Well, I see former students. They were stuck with listening for hours.
Thank you all so much for braving the heat. We like to get you ready for summer early. They're working on the air conditioning as we speak. Thank you all so much for being here today and for voting and for doing everything. Please remember to turn your ballots in on your way out. Dr. Barylski, I'm hoping will stay for any Q&A afterwards. Would you be willing? Can we steal you for longer? Okay, good. Because I know a lot of our folks have some questions. It is my great pleasure as president of this club to award Dr. Barylski
Another,
with the Kiwanis Golden Rule. No, you have to paper your walls with them because that's how I get you back. The Kiwanis Golden
Yeah.
Rule to help you measure your future success. It's very lucky.
yeah, I know.
Okay.
They're also sharp.
And we thank you so very much for
Thanks.
coming and speaking
I
with
love
us
these
today.
rulers.
May God bless you and your families. We are adjourned.